Okay, if you're reinvigorated after a cup of tea, coffee and biscuit. Final round of the day, Hilary Marlow again. Hilary's going to be picking up some of the things that we've talked about. What was that?
I said don't grow.
Some of the things that we talked about, we touched on earlier on in the day, on biblical and theological perspectives on personhood.
Great, thanks very much. Well, like Keith, I've sort of drawn the graveyard slot at the end of the day. So we're going to do some of the session in groups. So it won't be all me, and I'm hoping to finish in time for some questions as well. This is what is a person? What does it mean to be human? It's a really important question. We've touched on it in different aspects throughout the course so far. I think there are two reasons in particular that I'd like to highlight about why I think it matters really much that we engage with it, and they're kind of almost opposite ends of the spectrum, and they need to be sort of brought together somehow. And the first is the challenge of scientific reductionism, the challenge that says we are nothing more than the sum of our genes, if you're a geneticist, or the sum of our atoms, if you're a physicist, and it reduces us down to just, or some of your neurons, if you're a neuroscientist, that reduces us down to nothing but. And this is Dawkins' take on it. We're survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. This is a truth which still fills me with astonishment. I don't know if it's, presume for him it's positive astonishment. I don't know, he doesn't look very pleased, but anyway. And then this is a quote from Francis Crick, one of the discoverers of the structure of DNA. He said this: your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of identity and free will are in fact no more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. I mean, it's one of the ironies, particularly in neuroscientific attempts to define something like consciousness, for example, that you're using those neuronal processes to determine something that you end up saying, if you're a reductionist neuroscientist, is a neuronal process, which is a kind of a self-referential process that has some problems. Okay, so that scientific reductionism is the first issue. That means we have to think carefully about how we respond theologically, pastorally, to that challenge that we are nothing but. And the other sort of almost the side of it is what I call human hubris in a world under stress. And so we live in a world where, for example, there's this drive for ever-increasing economic growth, this idea that we can reach for the stars and obtain them. There's exploitation of the planet and people because of corruption and greed. Here's a quote from the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si that was mentioned earlier on, talking about the global warming being caused by huge consumption in the parts of some countries, having repercussions on the poorest areas of the world. And then saying that the multinationals operate in less developed countries in ways that they could never do at home, the countries where their economic capital is raised. So that's an example of human kind of, or at least in Western humanity, elevating itself perhaps more than it should do. Another interesting trend that has been noted by several psychologists is, it's not just psychology, you can see it everywhere, this idea that life is about pursuing ourselves at the expense of others. It's been noted that there's a huge shift towards narcissistic behaviour amongst young people in the United States in some studies. So, I've got a quote here. Not only are there more narcissists than ever, but non-narcissistic people are seduced by the increasing emphasis on material wealth, physical appearance, celebrity worship, and attention seeking. And you've only got to follow some of the stories of people like the Kardashians and others to realise that that is what is motivating and driving people. And it's aiming, ordinary people trying to aim for some aspiration of what it means to be human that is A, out of their reach, and B, unsustainable as well. And I notice also that, perhaps this has been true throughout the centuries, but there's a tendency to think about technology as the answers to all our problems. So we have increasingly in this day and age a great confidence that technology can solve environmental problems. Think of geoengineering, cloud seeding and so on. That technology can solve all our health problems, and so eventually we will all live forever. That technology can mean that we look good all the way through adulthood, we live longer and so on. So on the one hand you've got this, we're nothing but, and at the same time, and also, you know, butting up against it, we've got this search for attaining the maximum that we can, for saying there is no limit to what we as humans can achieve. And I want to address both of those today from a theological perspective. Rachel's going to hand out a handout for this lecture. And on it, right at the top of the handout, there are a list of what distinguishes us from other human beings. And this was a list drawn up by a psychologist, a cognitive psychologist called Warren Brown. And he listed, I think, 6 things that distinguish us, make us uniquely human. And I'd like you in your groups to talk about this list and talk about whether you agree with his list, what are the shortcomings, which are the ones that make sense and which are the ones that you have questions about. And just explore in your groups this list of what does it mean to be human, these 6 distinguishing characteristics that Warren Brown came up with. We'll do that for 5 or 10 minutes or so. I know what you're going to say, Anna, so say it, go on, say it. Stand up.
I actually had this conversation earlier. For me, the biggest problem with a list like this, and the biggest problem with any way of defining humanity which relies on mental capacity, is that it completely fails to take into account people with disabilities or with differing ways of expressing mental capacity. So for me, this is a non-starter because it's totally based on mental capacity.
Thank you very much. Any other comments? Anything else people would like to say? Anybody think it was positive or things about it that were positive? Yes?
I guess my sort of reply to that is that we sort of had that conversation, and is this, while this doesn't mean that someone with a disability isn't human, this is a list of capabilities of a species, and actually not all of them, but the flip side of that is this does actually, creating this allows you to discriminate. And that's the challenge, where it's not necessarily a bad list in its categorization of a species, it has other problems.
Okay. Yeah? Anything else? Yes. Can you stand up?
Yeah. If we go with all the things on this list, then maybe somebody with severe Alzheimer's might not fulfil any of these criteria, and does that mean that we are then at liberty to do euthanasia on them?
Okay. At the back there.
I think we felt as well that we had we didn't know whether we were looking for things that were sort of uniquely human, and also there was a limitation as to our understanding of other species as well. I'm sure some people would argue that certain other species have, for example, some sort of future orientation or theory of mind. I don't know enough about that. I don't know whether you know my group, but I don't know if we understood enough about that, or whether there's something about having this in a combination, perhaps to a higher degree than other species, that contributes to humanity, even if we accept this list. But I would agree with the comments on the Chinese as well.
Okay. One last comment.
A little bit of aesthetic content might be helpful.
Yeah, nothing on aesthetics, okay. Yeah, okay. As you can see, there are some limitations. There are lots of definitions like this whereby psychologists try to define personhood. And as we've noticed, they don't apply to various categories of people. I put this up because at a very extreme end, this is the thinking of people like Peter Singer. He makes a distinction between a human and a person. So he says this: there could be a person who is not a member of our species, and there could be members of our species who are not persons. So in other words, he's going by a list of capacities and suggesting, what he actually suggests is that some chimpanzees have more of these capacities than some humans do. And therefore, in some definitions, a chimpanzee has more personhood than a human being. And the implications for his thinking are around the area of right to life. And he says the only beings who have a right to life are those who can conceive of themselves as distinct entities existing at a time. Well, that immediately cuts out newborn babies. It cuts out people with Alzheimer's and various other medical conditions, and it cuts out quite a few people with severe learning disabilities. So, but he would say that's fine. He would argue that it would be legitimate to euthanize a newborn baby with disabilities because they had no prospect of growing into that kind of understanding of mind. And that would be preferable because chimpanzees in that instance have more moral considerability than either a newborn baby or someone with severe learning disabilities. So he would say that those are not persons. A human baby grows into personhood. Now, you might think that's very far-fetched, but actually there was a couple of medics published a journal article. I meant to get the exact title up on, but it said, should the baby live? And in it, they were saying, why is birth the cut-off point for deciding whether you can abort a severely disabled fetus or not? So why is we make this, he said, they say it's an arbitrary distinction, birth, that we should have the right, if a child is born severely disabled, to euthanize it after birth on this basis, this philosophical distinction. So this is an issue that isn't mainstream in kind of medical ethics, but it's there around the edge, and it's the kind of one of the reductionist outcomes of a reductionist perspective. Yes?
I'm sorry, just like remember, as a society, we whether we realise or not, we do that. If a child is born, if a child is stillborn, it doesn't get a birth certificate, and so it doesn't have the same legal standing.
Okay.
And so actually in our country, which is a real challenge, so having been in the womb even up to 9 months, and then having died before birth, it's not classed as a life. And so there's a different legal standing, which is a real challenge. So actually as a society, whether we realise that or not, we fall into that trap.
Yeah, thank you. I hadn't realised that.
Just follow that one. Such a child would not have had a funeral until fairly recently.
Fairly recently, yeah, absolutely. Yes.
So ethically then, is it right when a child is born very, very deformed for technology to keep that child alive without any real prospect of a life in our terms?
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? Is that ethically right? Because 100 years ago that child would have been allowed a natural death.
Well, that opens up a whole lot of ethical questions about medical interventions, not just at premature birth, but all the way through, doesn't it? Because we're faced now with the technology that means we can keep people alive, which we couldn't 20 years ago. To throw another question into the mix, and I'm not going to give answers to these questions, but they're things we need to think about. When my mother-in-law she was in a nursing home for many years, diagnosed, she didn't have Alzheimer's, she had dementia, severe dementia. She ended up not knowing anybody and so on. And it was very distressing to see her because she wasn't happy. She was a distressed dementia sufferer. And I remember reflecting at one point in time and thinking, pre-penicillin, people didn't get to that stage of health because something like pneumonia took them off. But she had an inoculation against pneumonia every year as part of the regime of the nursing home. And there was a little bit of me that was thinking, is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? Everything in me sort of practically, like rationally, was saying, no, we need to do everything we can to prevent people getting diseases and to treat the symptoms of their diseases when they get them. And I think that would include treating premature babies even if they have disability, because who's to say about what quality of life they might have. But then there's an emotional reaction that goes and says, well, is this really the way forward? Is this something that is the best way forward? So I think there are all sorts of questions there, so thank you for raising that one. Yes.
Just a short one. Interestingly, Peter Singer in 1999, when his mother suffered from Alzheimer's severely, spent an awful lot of money making sure she was looked after and prolonging her life as far as possible, despite her failing to qualify for one of the other personhood or whatever it was, to be a human, by his own definition.
Exactly, and I think that's the rub, that when you have a theory that hasn't been tested in your interpersonal relationships, then it can quite often fall by the wayside. I mean, Peter Singer has been known to say that if he was going to rescue one being from a burning building, he would choose the chimpanzee over the disabled child. Keith and I were talking about that, and I sort of said, yeah, but what if the disabled child was his? You know, I think that there's something different might come in there. These are all great issues that we need to be thinking about, and they will come up. We've got 20-25 minutes left. I can't do a huge amount to solve all the questions, but what I want to do is just unpack some biblical perspectives on being human. What is a human according to the Bible? And because I'm an Old Testament specialist, and because I think the Old Testament has the most to say, I'm going to stick there. And I want us to just reflect on that, and with these two questions I set up in the beginning, the challenge of scientific reductionism and the tendency of human species to hubris, to self-elevation. The first thing I want to say about the Old Testament is if you read it, an awful lot of it is concerned with stories about people and also reciting their poetry. There's a huge amount of the Old Testament is in poetic form, the prophets, the Psalms and so on, and a lot of the rest is stories about people. And so there's no sort of carefully worked out ethical treatise about the definition of personhood or whatever. It's been left to later scholars to do that. And if you read some of the narrative texts of the Old Testament, for example, the book of Judges, you get a very robust and honest depiction of human characters, plural, warts and all. You don't get a sort of sanitized version of what the ideal human should be. You get this in the raw story of people doing disgraceful things and people doing honourable things. And it seems to me that the Bible kind of tells human life like it is at both ends of the spectrum. You have saints and heroes, and you also have utterly despicable characters. And so the stories in the Bible have a lot of sin in them. There's a lot of wrongdoing in them, a lot of examples of wrongdoing, some of which we find quite troubling to read about. There's a lot of violence, there's a lot of hatred, there's a lot of enmity. I would say that there's sin in the Bible, but there's not original sin. It was left to Augustine to develop that doctrine. The Old Testament tells the story of Adam and Eve taking the apple and eating it and being kicked out of the garden, but it doesn't develop a doctrine of the fall. That's something that later Christian theologians do. Interestingly, Irenaeus talks about the fall as Adam and Eve losing their innocence that they had in the garden, developing knowledge rather than being sinful. And Augustine, as I said, develops more fully what we know now as the doctrine of original sin. The second thing I'd like to say about the Old Testament perspective is that human beings are a holistic unity in the Old Testament. There is no body-soul dichotomy in the Old Testament. I'd say there's arguably very little in the New Testament. There is a picture of human life in its entirety. Now, just a caveat, in a number of Bibles, the Hebrew word nephesh is often translated soul. It means actually living being. And Ruth actually explained earlier that in Genesis 2, God breathes his breath into Adam, who becomes a nephesh, a living being. But God has already done that with the animals. They have become nephesh as well, by God breathing into them. So nephesh is life, but it's often translated soul. And I want to give you an example of the translation problems. So this is from Micah 6:7, and it's saying, should I come before the Lord with multitudes of offerings? And He says, should I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? And then you can see in the translation there's this binary body-soul dichotomy set up, when actually the literal meaning of the Hebrew is the fruit of my womb, in other words, my firstborn, for the sin of my life, in other words, my transgression. So that is classic Hebrew parallelism, where the first phrase is mirrored by the second phrase, exactly, rather than, as the English translation suggests, a bit of a dichotomy between your body atoning for what your soul has committed as transgression. And those kind of instances crop up all the way through the Old Testament, and it's well to be alert to them. And as someone who has taught Hebrew, it's a very good reason for knowing just a little bit about the ancient languages. And if you're wrestling with either Hebrew or Greek at the moment, I would just say persevere, it's worth it for that very reason. Okay, I don't know if I didn't ask you what your first thought of is when I decided that I'm going to talk about the Bible and what it means to be human, but how many might have suggested that the first thing that came to mind was image of God? Quite a few of you, and that's perhaps the first thing that many people think of. Ruth touched on that a little. We're going to come back to it hopefully in a moment. But the interesting thing about image of God is it's so infrequent in the Old Testament, and arguably not much more in the New. It only crops up in Genesis 1, 5 and 9. It only crops up 3 other times in the New Testament, 2 of which refer to Christ, and we're going to get on to that in a moment. So I'm going to park that for a moment. Hopefully we'll come back to it. And it's something that is a difficult question to answer. What does it mean? But I want to go on about one or two other reflections that I have on the Old Testament. And the next thing I'd like to talk about is the sense of mystery and wonder that the Old Testament conveys about what it means to be human. And I think in a way that's a response to, I can't see his name, your question. Didn't you ask Ruth about seeing humans as problematic and that being a bit of a difficulty? The Bible has this real sense of wonder and awe that God is prepared to deal with human beings. You see that in Psalm 139, you have searched me and you know me. And that sense of the profound mystery of God encountering human beings individually or corporately. And also in Psalm 139, there's the biological mystery of conception there. You knit me together in my mother's womb. We don't know what the understanding was in that era of what the process of development of a fetus was, but there's obviously some understanding, and it's attributed to God at work in the developing embryo. And then if you look at somewhere like Psalm 8, you see this tension, which I guess we've all felt, between our insignificance, if you consider a night sky, and yet our sense that we are somehow special to God. And that comparison with the scale of the universe, which reduces us down to a sense of being very, very small and insignificant. And yet that sense also that God has spoken to us, revealed himself to us, is there working through us and in us. So that sense of mystery and wonder is prevalent in the Old Testament. You see it a lot in the Psalms. Then the other thing I'd like to talk about is what I call our creatureliness. And you'll remember, if you know your Genesis 1 creation account, that actually humankind is created on the same day as all the land animals. So that's we're on the same day, we're part of that same package. And it's interesting if you read some of the Psalms, particularly Psalm 148 and Psalm 150, that actually the capacity, those Psalms are talking about worshipping God. Psalm 150 says that everything that has breath worship God, let every living creature worship God. And actually Psalm 148 talks about non-animate things worshipping God, mountains and rocks and so on. So it seems to suggest in the Psalms that the capacity to worship God is not something that is unique to humans, it's something we actually share with the rest of creation. It's something that makes us creatures along with the rest of God's creation. Our creatureliness is also demonstrated in places like Job 38 to 41. Remember, the great sort of creation hymn where God addresses Job out of the whirlwind and says, where were you when I did this and this and I created the weather and the seasons and the mountains and so on. And there's that sense that Job is kind of getting smaller and smaller, as it were, in response to that kind of question. And again, it's that sense of human insignificance in the presence of not just divine revelation, but the workings of the world and its creation. We see also our sense of creatureliness in somewhere like Psalm 104, which I recommended to you earlier, which talks about human beings as one of many different species who all look to God to find their food. So God is the creator of all, and we, like all the other species, are dependent on him for our sustenance. So those texts are putting us, reminding us, if you like, of our creatureliness. Now, I tend to think that in the present day and age, and particularly in the light of the stuff I said earlier about hubris and our tendency to ascend ourselves above that which our proper place, that we need to remember our creatureliness perhaps more often than we do. Let's think a little bit about life and death in the Old Testament. We read in Psalm 2, in Psalm 104, that life is God-breathed. God breathes breath into human beings. And life is from God, but also returns to God. It's a kind of a very robust view, if you like, of the biological process of life beginning and life ending. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord, kind of idea. And in the Old Testament, death is part of a natural and inevitable biological process. Decay is inevitable. The human being, along with other creatures, is from dust and will return to dust. And if you actually, search through, you'll find an incredible number of metaphors for human transience, human frailty. We're likened to the flowers that blossom and fade, the grass that is here today and gone tomorrow, dust, and so on. So there seems to be this real emphasis in awareness of transience, awareness of frailty, awareness that death is an inevitable end to the process. The exceptions to that are when, it seems to me, the Bible is talking about premature death. So for example, when David's newborn son dies, there's that sense of struggling against that. When Hezekiah is sick, he prays and God gives him an extra however many years of life. So there's a right sense in struggling against premature death, but there's that sense of the rhythm of season of cycles of life and death that is part of the biblical world. Now, I'm very positive about all the medical interventions that will keep me alive for longer than I would have lived 100 years ago as I get older, and I know we all are. But I also wonder if in our society today we have this, death is the sort of last thing we talk about. We don't want to confront it. We shy away from the possibility. In less so now, but in medical circles, doctors don't always like to say, well, actually, there's nothing more we can do for you, or you're dying. And there's that sense, reluctance to give up any possibility that medically we can sort this out, to let go and say, actually, all lives come to an end. And we will all become dust one day. And that's the reality of life. And the Bible spells it out really beautifully and poignantly. And of course, no one's not wanting to say that if someone that we love dearly dies, it's not painful. We know that it is. And yet that rhythm of life and death is part of the biblical picture. And I think we need to be aware of that. I remember in a church I was in leadership of, somebody that had been quite involved in the church got cancer at the age of about 40, and the church prayed, as churches do, and the man still died. And a woman came to me who I thought was a really solid Christian, and she just said, that's really rocked my faith in God. I don't know if I can be a Christian anymore. because her whole worldview was predicated on God doesn't let bad things happen to good people. He was a good person, she said. He should not have died. And I'm sure none of us here think like that, but I think that view is really common out there. And there's that sense that people, when they're faced with something like an unexpected death, or even sometimes a death at the end of a life well lived, struggle with it, it rocks their faith. And I think as pastors and teachers and clergy, we need to be able to help people to have a robust understanding of death in its right time. You remember when people like Abraham and Moses die in the Old Testament, it says something like, and Abraham died old and full of years and was gathered to his fathers. And I really like that expression. It's something about a completion. And of course, perhaps some of us had experience of people that have died where it has been that sense of completion. And some of us will have had experience where it hasn't been that good. And yet there is that sense that it is part of the ongoing rhythm of life, following life, following life. Another thing that the Old Testament has a lot to say is warning against hubris. So think about the Tower of Babel. What was the problem there? Well, the problem was that human beings were trying to elevate themselves up to heaven, to reach God. Think about the prophet Isaiah and his indictment of people like the Assyrians or Tyre. If you look, you read, you find so often his charge against them is that they thought that they could play God. They thought that they could elevate themselves. And Isaiah's oracle is, no, you will be cast down. You thought you could lift yourself up, but you will be cast down. So that's just a little bit of a flavour of some of the perspectives in the Old Testament on what it means to be human. I think they have implications for how we live. I think they have implications for how we live in terms of environment. I think they have implications for how we treat the non-human creation. But I also think that they have implications for the way that we conduct pastoral ministry amongst those that we're working with, and how we treat people with disability, mental incapacity, and so on. Okay, I'm going to come back now to image of God in the last few minutes. What is it? If you could say one phrase that strikes you when you think of image of God, what would it be? What is the image of God?
Jesus.
Okay, Jesus, great.
Relationship.
Relationship.
Creative.
Creative.
I think there's a risk that people think man.
As opposed to not woman. Yeah, okay, yes. Anything else? Okay. Just trying to think how to go.
What about unfathomable?
Unfathomable. The image of God, unfathomable.
Well, are we fathomable as people?
No, God even less so, yes. Okay, brilliant. Well, as I said, image of God language is only a couple of times in the Old Testament, but scholars have spent this vast amount of pen and ink trying to work out what it means. In the early days of the church, right through to the Middle Ages, they thought it was something structural. There was something, the soul or something like that, that came into you that was gave you some capacity or a cognitive function that distinguished you from other created beings, something that all humans share. I've got a couple of quotes here. That God made him in his own image, said Augustine, by giving him an intellectual soul which raises him above the beasts of the field. Now, that makes all sorts of problems for people that haven't got intellectual capacity, as well as posing all sorts of questions about our relationship with other animals. The functional view, Ruth talked briefly about this, the idea that in the ancient Near East, the king was the image of the god, and therefore in Genesis it's being democratized to apply to all people. They are the image of the god. And then more recently, theologians have suggested that a relational view is at play. Now, I apologise, Carl Bart's gender language is perhaps not what we're used to, but he thought that the reciprocal relationship between human beings is God's image in us. Now I can see Anna probably thinking there's a problem with this, and I agree with you, that doesn't again translate well into people with severe disability or people with cognitive issues or people with Alzheimer's, because reciprocal relationship is often what's lacking, it's often what's not there. So I rather like Robert Jensen's talk about relating to God as a conversational counterpart, because God speaks to us, we know he is personal, and as we answer to him, we too are personal. Now, I wouldn't like to define too closely what he means by conversation. I suggest that people that don't have language may well be conversational counterparts with God. In fact, I think that is undoubtedly the case. Keith and I were talking about people in persistent vegetative state, which is perhaps the least group that's perhaps least able to think of being able to have a conversation with God or engage in any way. And we think this is a tricky area. It's not easy to say what makes a person in PVS in the image of God. I wonder two things. I wonder, first of all, if it's to do with our relating to them as God's image. So the way that we relate to someone who does not have the cognitive capacities that we have, might that make the image of God in them real? And the second thing I want to say is that all of these definitions, I think I've got another one there you are. Again, this is engagement of human persons. I have problems with all of these in different ways, but the problem I have with most of them is that they're very individualistic, and that perhaps reflects the theology of our time. When God created human being in his image in Genesis 1, it's not talking about an individual, it's talking about a whole category. And I wonder if by our individualistic theology, we limit the image of God by saying it's the image of God in me, the image of God in you. I wonder if the image of God is actually demonstrated in corporate terms, and it's something that we give and take to one another in our corporate settings, something that we do communally. When we take time to engage with someone with severe mental disability or Alzheimer's or something, we are being part in community with them, and we're perhaps engaging the image of God together. There was an interesting study, I wish I'd copied the details, it was referred to in the paper just last weekend, which suggested that even people with Alzheimer's, a suggestion, I don't know how they measured it, but even people with the most severe Alzheimer's benefit from having people visit them. And just something about being in community that seems to make a difference. I just want to say one other thing, actually. And that's just to go back to the New Testament briefly. There's a lot of references to image in the New Testament, but we have to be cautious because most of them just mean image in more general terms, and most of them actually in Revelation for the image of the beast. So we won't go there. But somebody said the image of God is Jesus, and in the New Testament, image has a very Christological focus. So Christ is the image or likeness of God in 2 Corinthians 4:4 and Colossians 1:15. In 2 Corinthians, it's celebrating the glory of God that's been revealed in Christ as God's image. And Colossians 1 is celebrating the divinity of Christ as creator, but also his humanity through which he reconciles everything to himself. And then a couple of other references in Romans and 2 Corinthians talk about the transformative power of God at work in us through Christ, that is changing us into the image of God and anticipating a future resurrection glory. And those two ideas, none of these definitions really talk about Christ at all. That sense that image of God is communal, that it's centered in the being, person, work of Christ, and that it's something that is in this yet here, yet not fully here stage that we are in, where we're looking forward to a future glory where we'll be perfectly in the image of God as Christ is. I'm going to stop there. I want to end with one quote, which, having gone through my talk and been thinking about it as I've been going, I'm not entirely sure if I agree with him, but it's an interesting book to read if you want more. He's stressing the physicality of our sense of personhood, our sense of identity. It's tied up to the whole cosmos, we're part of an entity, and also our life experiences, our stories, our relationships. And so the sense of personhood, that those that don't have access to their own stories, whether it's through age or disability or whatever, they're part of our stories. And I think we can engage with that, with them, in a meaningful way. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Are we just going to go straight to questions, please?
Well, thank you, Hilary. But that's raised a lot of issues, so I'm sure there's plenty of questions that you haven't touched on already. So we've got 10 minutes. Who would like to kick off?
I was interested in the answers that we actually gave to your question about the image of God. I have a nasty suspicion that if we asked that in a more secular group, if I could just use that as a crude analysis, we might get the answer among them, an old man. And I wonder to what extent we actually suffer for that old man image.
In what sense? Sorry.
Well, just that if you were to choose someone to lead, you might choose to lead, follow an old man because of his wisdom, but it might not be in a lot of other ways.
Yes. That's an interesting thought. I mean, I hadn't thought about that, but...
I think that's Daniel.
Sorry?
I think that's Daniel.
Just endorsing the idea of Jesus being the image, because he does show us God in human form, but he also shows us perfect humanity, doesn't he? In one package, we get the complete answer. You know, it's just like the old Sunday school thing. You know, the answer is always Jesus, but it's true in this case.
I think it's the one thing we haven't said about why this is important is the question of salvation. And I think that's partly why it matters so clearly what we as Christians have as a view of what counts as human. And behind that are lots of issues that are very contentious, but also I think that's where issues of disability and so on come in. Because if somebody is not human, then are they saved? And if we consider, and that's why these definitions are, I think, so important, because we are potentially ruling people out by poor definitions and poor understanding of what constitutes humanity.
I don't know. I think that's a really good point, and I think that begs all sorts of questions. We haven't got time to answer now, but I think it's real. I mean, I don't know what your view is, but my view is that the salvation of God in Christ is available to anybody, whatever their mental capacities, and I'm not in a position to make any comment about someone who dies either because as a newborn child without any capacity or as a person without mental capacity all the way through their life, because that's actually God's business, yes. But come on.
So I move on with questions. So one here and then one across there.
I was wondering if it might be helpful, though I realise it has its own problems, to bring together the idea of the image of God with the body of Christ. Because there's a sense there of all belonging in relation to one another in a way that's intrinsic, that doesn't depend on my capacity to be able to, whatever. But also it means that each part is indispensable, because you can't go chopping off bits of the body and still be whole. So that preserves something of the value of everybody, regardless of measurable extrinsic factors.
Actually, I think that's a really, really helpful analogy, and of course there are points at which the bringing together would break down, but actually I was talking to somebody in the tea break about that, and we were saying just that this communal aspect of what the image of God might mean, the best analogy for it, I think, is the body of Christ. And of course, Christ is the head of his body, just as Christ is the perfect image of God. So maybe we confer worth on other people by viewing them fully as part of the body of Christ, and whatever their capacity and age.
I was interested in that Peter Singer comment about the arbitrariness of birth and why we treat the moment of birth as something where personhood attaches. Now, of course, for a lot of Christians, birth is not the point where personhood attaches, and that's why a lot of Christians are, after a lot of very painful and difficult deliberation, against abortion as well. And I don't want to bring up a debate about that. It's a very difficult and emotionally charged issue. But it was interesting that a lot of the examples we talked about of ambiguity of personhood were circumstances where you have a fully formed life that somehow doesn't match our expectations of what a flourishing life is. Whereas I think there is a debate in this as well about fetal development and where personhood comes into that as well.
I absolutely agree with you, and thank you for the comment. Yeah.
There's a question over this side, and then over there, and then we'll maybe done.
Just a comment around the sort of the sense of the mystery of God. And I'm not an expert, but the term of Yahweh, which is I am who I am, so God becomes a self-defining sort of label or whatever. And although that's quite a mysterious thing, again, we're invited to go into that as well in a relationship. So that whole mysterious way of defining personhood, which allows for, well, it can't be defined in many ways. I find that quite reassuring as well.
I think this may have to be the last question, and then save the rest till tomorrow.
I'm just wondering if the language of existentialism might help in that we're talking just being and God being the ground of our being, as opposed to an awful lot we've heard of is sort of doing what you can do, or just being is the image of God, your being in yourself. And the ground of our being is God himself. It may or may not be useful. It may be a theological dinosaur, but maybe I am one.
No, thank you. Thank you. Helpful.
I'm at the back, but I think at this stage it's time to draw things to a close. You've obviously provoked a lot of questions, and there are still some more coming. Thank you, Hilary, and can we express our appreciation.